Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take seminal works of history and philosophy, stack up the research, and really try to extract the blueprint for modern thought.
And today, we're looking at something that's, well, it's not just a document.
No, it's more like a volcanic reaction. We're diving into a text written in a white heat of urgency that laid out this incredibly radical, fully costed blueprint for a new society, Thomas Paine's Rights of Man.
That phrase you used, white heat,
Yeah.
that is absolutely the key here.
Well-
This is not Paine sitting down in a quiet study, calmly penning some philosophical treatise.
Right.
This book is a direct, almost ferocious response to a single event. And that event was the publication of Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France.
And Burke's book, when it came out, it was a huge deal.
It was an immediate sensation. It dropped on November 1st, 1790, and it was this powerful, almost religious defense of the ancient order, of tradition, of hierarchy. And Paine, he read it and felt he had absolutely no choice but to respond, to defend what he saw as the foundational principles of liberty.
And what makes the whole thing so dramatic is the personal context here. I mean, these two men, Paine and Burke, they weren't just abstract philosophical opponents arguing from across the world.
Not at all. They knew each other. They had just months before this whole firestorm been dining together.
So Paine, at this point, he's a celebrated figure, right? He's a key player in the American Revolution. Now he's friends with people like Lafayette and Jefferson.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he's actually in Europe pursuing his own engineering invention.
The Iron Bridge.
The famous Iron Bridge, yeah.
Yeah.
He's trying to get this massive project built in both Paris and England. So from about 1787 to 1790, his focus is really non-political. He's an inventor and engineer.
And Burke even hosted him?
He did. Burke hosted him at his estate, Beaconsfield. So the idea that Paine was, secretly harboring some revolutionary plot against the English crown at that time, it just wasn't true.
In fact, his actual position on what was happening in France was, well, a lot more moderate than what he ended up publishing in Rights of Man.
Absolutely. When he was in France right before Burke's book came out, Paine's preferred path was actually a constitutional compromise for Louis XVI.
So keep the king.
Sort of. Keep the king, but abolish hereditary succession. Make the monarchy elective, or at least a fully constitutional one.
Yeah.
He was looking for evolution, not this immediate violent overthrow.
So what changed?
Burke's book changed everything. It was Burke's fierce, completely uncompromising attack on the very right of the people to reform their own government that just, it radicalized Paine. It forced the pen into his hand.
So our mission today is to really unpack this foundational text. We need to get into Paine's core philosophy, his revolutionary definition of human rights, his complete demolition of the English constitutional system.
And maybe the most surprising part for a lot of people, the stunningly detailed financial and social proposals he laid out.
Down to the shilling.
Down to the last shilling. He believed this plan would create a true, prosperous republic. And, this is the shortcut to understanding why this book was so dangerous, why it got him outlawed.
Right. Let's start with the big debate then. Paine versus Burke.
To really understand Rights of Man, you absolutely have to understand the man and the ideas that Paine was trying to tear down.
Edmund Burke.
Edmund Burke. And Burke once said something. Maybe it was dark humor, maybe not. He remarked of himself and Paine, "We hunt in pairs."
We hunt in pairs. What does that even mean?
Well, if they were hunting, they represented two completely different species of political thought that could just never coexist in the same ecosystem.
So this wasn't just them disagreeing on, say, tax policy.
Oh, no. It was much, much more fundamental. They were disagreeing on the nature of reality, on the very source of political authority.
Okay, so let's break that down. What was Paine's foundation?
Paine's foundation was built on what he saw as eternal principles. He was deeply influenced by his early Quakerism.
And how did that shape his political thought?
Well, Quakerism emphasizes the universal fatherhood of God. And if you believe that, it necessarily implies a universal brotherhood of man. And from there, you get to absolute equality among all people. For Paine, politics had to follow these universal moral truths.
So it's a bottom-up philosophy based on the individual and their inherent rights.
And an unshakable faith in the people. A faith in their ability to exercise reason, to choose their best representatives, and to perpetually improve their condition. He believed in the right of the present generation to govern itself, unconstrained by the dictates of the past.
Okay, so that's Paine, grounded in reason, equality, and the rights of the living. What about Burke?
Burke is the complete opposite. He's a traditionalist, almost mystical in how he views governance. He believed in what he called a divine tactic.
A divine tactic?
Yeah, a divine plan. that it assigned every single person a specific place in the existing social and political order. For Burke, political legitimacy wasn't found in some abstract principle, like truth or falsehood.
It was found in what worked.
It's exactly political expediency. What produced a stable, manageable outcome. That was the most important thing. He prioritized good or evil over truth or falsehood.
So Burke is all about preserving the existing structures, seeing them as these fragile, organic things that have grown over centuries.
Precisely. Burke's greatest fear was that if you broke those existing contracts, those inherited customs, society would just instantly dissolve into chaos. It would become a mere collection of, I think his phrase was, vague, loose individuals.
Stripped of their loyalties, their duties, their history.
Yeah, so where Paine saw the potential for improvement, Burke saw dissolution. Where Paine saw principle, Burke saw a really dangerous abstraction.
And this philosophical chasm, it leads to what the source material calls a really tragic irony when it comes to the fate of the French king.
It does, because Paine, the radical Republican, was actually the one pleading for restraint and peace.
While Burke, the champion of order, was, well, he was fueling the fire.
The historical evidence here is, it's pretty startling. When Louis XVI was imprisoned and facing trial, Paine was a member of the French National Convention.
So he's right there in the middle of it all.
Right in the thick of it. And he risks his own safety to argue for clemency. He suggests that Louis should be exiled to America. Paine consistently strove for a peaceful resolution. He saw the monarchy as a phantom, something that could just be dismissed, not a person who needed to be executed.
And Burke, the great monarchist who was writing these horrified passages about the bloodshed in France, what was he doing at this time?
He was secretly corresponding with the French royal family. The sources are quite clear on this. He wrote letters to Queen Marie Antoinette, urging her not to seek any political compromise with the new revolutionary government.
So don't negotiate.
Don't negotiate. He told her to trust to the support of foreign armies. Burke was explicitly advocating for foreign military intervention to come in and crush the revolution.
So the man who is warning the world about French anarchy is the one actively pushing the king and queen towards a massive military conflict.
A conflict that absolutely guaranteed greater bloodshed and, in the end, sealed the king's fate.
That's incredible.
And Paine makes this argument forcefully in his writing. He says that Burke's actions, this effort to foment a league of monarchs against France, were the direct catalyst that drove the French people into a kind of maddened desperation.
Because they feared a total reversal, brutal retribution if those foreign armies won.
Of course. And that fear, according to Paine's analysis, is what brought on the horrors of the September massacres, the Reign of Terror, and ultimately the execution of the king. Burke's absolute pursuit of preservation paradoxically guaranteed absolute destruction.
That reframes their entire disagreement. It moves it from a theoretical debate about how to govern to a very real argument about who is actually responsible for the violence of the era.
And if you look at their political fates afterwards, it just reinforces this duality. Burke was rewarded handsomely for defending the establishment. He retired on a large royal pension, his comfort and legacy totally secure.
And Paine.
Paine for daring to write Rights of Man, a book that sold hundreds of thousands of copies to ordinary people. He was outlawed in England for seditious libel.
And Paine himself believed Burke was behind that prosecution, didn't he?
He certainly suspected it, and the tragedy for him just deepened. Later on, when Paine was in France and he started opposing the extremism of the terror, he was thrown in prison.
Right.
And his release was initially blocked by the very associates of Burke who had taken refuge in France. It suggests the influence of that anti-Republican faction was long-lasting and personal. So Burke hunted to preserve the old order, and Paine, having hunted for principle, became the ultimate prey. He paid for his idealism with his freedom.
It's a powerful lesson in the risks of political principle versus political expediency.
It really is.
Let's move on from the debate, then, to the construction. Because Paine didn't just tear down Burke's arguments, he built an entirely new philosophical foundation from the ground up.
Right. So Paine understood that before you can criticize a government, you first have to define the citizen. His entire system rests on this really precise definition and classification of rights. He breaks them down into two main types.
And this is the distinction between natural rights and civil rights.
Exactly, a distinction that is often missed today, but for him it was crucial.
Okay, let's start with the natural rights. What are they, according to Paine?
Natural rights are inherent. They're the rights that appertain to us just by virtue of our existence. They are what we possess simply by being human.
So things like freedom of thought,
Religious liberty, the right to form your own opinions, those are all intellectual rights. But it also includes the right of every individual to act for his own comfort and happiness, as long as that action doesn't injure the natural rights of others.
And the key element here, the thing that defines them as natural rights, is that the individual's power to execute these rights is complete.
That's the critical point. I don't need a government or a society to grant me the right to think or the right to worship. I can do it myself.
They're inalienable because you possess the full capacity to exercise them.
Correct. And because of that, the aggregate power of society can never justly invade or control these retained natural rights. You can't surrender your right to think to a collective. It's impossible.
Okay, so that's the first category. How does he then get from there to the second category, the civil rights?
Civil rights are the rights we acquire by being a member of society. And this is the philosophical core of his idea of the state. They derive from natural rights.
Okay.
But they pertain only to those rights where the individual's power to execute them is defective.
Defective. What does he mean by a defective individual power?
Okay, let's take an example. Think about the natural right to protection and security. By nature, you have a right to defend yourself and to judge an injury against you. But what if someone much stronger than you attacks you? Or if you're injured while traveling far from home? In those cases, your individual power to get justice, to redress that injury, or to guarantee your future security is highly limited. It is, in a word, defective.
I see. So if my individual power to defend myself is imperfect, I need to combine it with others.
That is the exact mechanism. You deposit this specific imperfect right, the right to judge and punish in your own cause, into the common stock of society.
The common stock.
The aggregate power of society then takes on the responsibility for that collective security and protection. So society isn't granting you anything new, it's merely returning your own rights to you, but now they're perfected and secured by collective strength.
This is a really radical concept because it makes society itself the fundamental source of order, not the government.
Yes, government is just the apparatus for administering this common stock of rights. And this leads directly to his view on social order, which he explains in part 2 of the book. Society is primary, government is secondary.
He argues that most of the peace and order we see every day isn't because of government dictates.
Not at all. It's a natural effect of society itself. He points to the mechanics of commerce, of human interaction. Nature compels us into society through our shared necessities. We have diverse wants, and just as importantly, through our innate social affections.
So even if government suddenly vanished tomorrow,
Commerce wouldn't just descend into anarchy. The merchant still needs the farmer. The manufacturer still needs the trader. Reciprocal interest, common usage, shared prosperity. Those things regulate our concerns. They form a practical law that exists completely independent of any formal government.
so government's only legitimate role is minimalist. It's just there to fill in the few gaps where society can't easily regulate itself.
Precisely. And he argues that the more civilized a society becomes, the less government it actually needs. A complex commercial society requires far fewer coercive laws than a simplistic military one.
Okay, so if government is just this creature of society, bound by these rational principles, then the rules for its creation have to be written down somewhere.
Yes, and this brings us to his incredibly rigid definition of a constitution.
For Paine, it can't just be an idea or a tradition.
No. The Constitution must be a tangible, visible, real existence. If you cannot produce the document, quote its articles, and hold it up for inspection, then, in his view, you do not have a constitution.
It has to be the founding act of the people, and it must come before the government itself.
It is absolutely antecedent to government. Government is its creature. The Constitution is what details the principles, the organization, the powers, the elections, the duration of power. It is the authority by which a government even exists.
And if a government tries to step outside those bounds,
Then the people, the sovereign, must hold it accountable. A government without an antecedent written constitution is just a government of arbitrary will.
and this, of course, sets the stage for his most devastating critique of his own country, the United Kingdom.
That the English system is non-constitutional.
He argues that this whole boast of an English constitution is just a fallacy.
It is. Burke and others were claiming the Constitution was this perfect mixture of king, lords, and commons, a perfect balance. Paine's response is simple. Show me the document. Where is the acts of the people that constituted this balance?
He then goes on to just dismantle the very documents that are often cited as the foundation of English liberty.
Right. He dismisses things like the Magna Charta and the Bill of Rights. He says they're not constitutions. They're merely documents of reconquest.
Reconquest.
Yes. The power was taken away from the people by the Norman conquest. So these documents were simply attempts by the people or the nobility to claw back rights that had been stolen by a tyrannical government. They didn't establish a new government based on popular consent. They only put some restrictions on an existing and, in his view, illegitimate power.
And he's particularly scathing about the Bill of Rights from 1689.
He calls it an insult to the nation.
Why? What's so insulting about it?
Because in his analysis, the only national right it explicitly secured was the right of petitioning the sovereign. And he frames this with total contempt. He says something like, "A right to complain is all the right that was secured."
So it treats the nation like a slave who is only allowed to voice its misery.
Exactly. A supplicant, not a sovereign body establishing its own rule. The whole system is built on historical grants and permissions from the crown, rather than on inherent rights established by the living population.
So for Paine, the English people are free only by the grace of what their ancestors managed to get back, not by the virtue of their own sovereign act of creation.
Precisely. The government is its own foundation, which is a logical absurdity. He sees the whole complex system as a machine designed for one purpose, to confuse the people and prevent them from asking the most fundamental question of all.
Which is?
By what right do you govern?
Okay, so once Paine establishes that the living have the right to create their own government based on reason, the entire hereditary system, which is fundamentally based on the dead binding the living, it just becomes politically and philosophically indefensible.
It does. And Paine absolutely delights in stripping away all the glamour and mystique of monarchy and returning it to what he saw as its savage origins. His description of how kings came to be is incredibly cynical, but also very memorable.
He argues that monarchy began with, what, bands of robbers?
Yes, that's his phrase. He says they initially took control by force, and only over time did the name robber give way to the more respectable name of monarch.
But the nature of the government didn't change.
No. These governments, being rooted in violence and plunder, naturally continued the practice. War became their trade. He calls government a faro table, which refers to this high-stakes, fraudulent gambling game that was popular at the time.
And in this game, the nations are the dupes, the ones being played by the monarchs.
Exactly. It's such an effective rhetorical device because you can't really criticize the huge costs of monarchy without first admitting that the service it provides is fundamentally the organization of conflict for profit. It's a mechanism for revenue and dominion, totally distinct from the nation's actual interests.
And he just keeps asking this simple, powerful question.
What service does a monarch actually perform? Is the crown not just a silly, contemptible thing? Does wisdom or virtue somehow reside in the goldsmith's work? He argues the whole system is a bubble, a show maintained by courts for one reason: to procure vast amounts of public money.
But the true philosophical offense for him isn't the king as a person. It's the doctrine of hereditary succession. Why is that so offensive to him? Even if a nation initially agreed to it, why is it inherently a form of despotism?
Because it precludes the consent of all succeeding generations. It's simple. No generation has the right to bind future generations. To assume hereditary power is to willingly sign away and control the rights of the living by the assumed authority of the dead.
And that preclusion of consent, carried forward indefinitely,
is the definition of despotism. It doesn't matter how benevolently the power might be exercised in one generation. The principle itself is tyrannical.
This idea of the living holding sovereignty is just absolute for Paine, which leads him to this incredibly sharp piece of irony. He calls hereditary power the only true leveling system.
It's a brilliant reversal of the accusation.
Yeah.
The aristocratic class was constantly terrified that Paine and his followers were promoting leveling, the destruction of rank, property, and social order.
Right.
And Paine just flips that accusation right back at them. He says, no, your system is the one that's a mental leveling. It subjects the governance of an entire nation to every possible accident of individual human frailty.
Meaning it applies the same level of authority regardless of a person's ability or character?
Precisely. It indiscriminately puts vice and virtue, ignorance and wisdom on the exact same plane simply because of lineage. It subjects the whole apparatus of government to childhood, to idiocy, to decrepitude.
And he has that great line about boys growing to be men.
Yes. The nation is forced to wait for boys to grow to be men, yet these same individuals at the age of 18, are entrusted with the fate of the entire country, at an age when they wouldn't even be trusted with the sale of a single acre of land or the management of a flock of sheep. It's a complete inversion of rational, natural order.
And this indictment, it extends directly to the aristocracy, especially through the economic mechanism of primogeniture.
He sees aristocratic titles as, meaningless. He calls them the baby clothes of count and duke, things that separate the titled person from genuine connection with society. But primogeniture, the practice of bequeathing all property and titles to the eldest son, he condemns that as unnatural and unjust, a law against nature itself.
And he frames this law as creating a kind of family tyranny. How does that tyranny play out, both for the family and for the public?
Well, it forces the younger children, who he says are begotten to be devoured, onto the public expense. The unnatural parent, driven by this desire to maintain the concentration of hereditary landed power in one person, essentially casts these younger sons out.
And then the public has to pick up the tab.
The public has to create unnecessary offices, sinecures, and positions in government, the court, or the military, what Paine calls drones, who exist for lazy enjoyment, just to provide an income for the disinherited younger branches of the aristocracy.
So the aristocracy maintains its power at the family level by disinheriting its own children, and then it makes the public pay the welfare costs for these unemployed noblemen.
It's a costly, unnatural cycle. And when it comes to legislative power, the hereditary nature of the House of Peers, the Lords, makes their political actions completely self-interested, especially when it comes to money.
And he gives a very specific, detailed example of how the Lords shift the tax burden onto the poor.
He does. He highlights that this combination of aristocrats, whose self-interest is always paramount, invariably throws taxes onto the consumption of the working poor. The classic example he uses is the tax on beer brewed for sale.
Right, because the big landowners brew their own.
Exactly. The landowners, who typically brew their own beer on their large estates, were exempt from this duty. This tax on commercial beer, Paine calculates, was nearly equal to the entirety of the land tax. It's a system designed from the ground up to defend the landed interest by taxing the daily consumption of the common person.
So the hereditary system is proven to be, in his eyes, both economically parasitic and legislatively biased.
Completely.
And that brings us directly to the numbers. Because Paine doesn't just provide the moral critique. He provides the financial calculation that he believes justifies a revolution.
Yes, and this is Paine's great strength. He translates all this theoretical critique into a line-by-line budget comparison. He proves, with hard numbers, that the entire system of monarchy is a financial absurdity designed for institutional corruption.
And he starts by contrasting the cost of the single English monarchy against the entire American federal government. That gap must have been, just staggering for people to read at the time.
It was. You have to think about the context. America was 10 times the size of England, geographically. It was founded on this complex new system of representation. And yet, the entire expense of the U.S. federal government was only about £135,000 annually.
Okay, £135,000 for the whole federal system.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what about England?
Well, look at England. The civil list, which is the money allocated for the personal upkeep of the king and the court, was nearly £1 million a year.
$1 million. So the cost for one man in England was what?
It was approximately 8 times the cost of the entire executive and legislative functioning of the American Republic.
That is an incredible statistic. And Paine doesn't just say this is because the king loves luxury. He ties it to foreign and anti-national interests.
Yeah, absolutely. The Hanoverian line of kings meant that the King of England was also a German elector. Paine argues the enormous expenditure was necessary because the king treated England as a mere town residence, while prioritizing his German electorate and German interests.
So English taxes were funding German despotism.
And entangling England in unnecessary European wars that were designed purely to protect German territories. This cost argument then leads to his brilliant realization that the monarchy is, in his words, a costly superfluity. It's an unnecessary layer of government.
How so?
He argues that the genuine vital function of keeping the peace and administering the laws, everything from the local constable to the magistrates, the juries, the courts, that is already being executed by the people at their own expense.
So that's the de facto Republican government that's already operating.
It's already there. The crown is just a costly name, a machine kept up to procure money and amuse the nation with titles and ceremonies. If you abolish the crown, the effective administration of the country continues, completely unhindered.
Now, if the English system is so financially corrupt, The French Revolution must have proved the opposite, despite what Burke was claiming about it leading to national bankruptcy.
Paine uses the figures presented by M. Necker, who was the French finance minister, to demonstrate the massive underlying strengths of the French economy. Before the Revolution, France had over 91 million sterling in circulating gold and silver.
91 million.
It's a colossal sum.
Yeah.
It completely dwarfed England's estimated 20 million. So the revolutionary government wasn't founded on bankruptcy. It was just burdened by the massive debt of the old monarchical system.
And that revolutionary government proved it could be fiscally efficient almost immediately.
Yes, by seizing and selling the vast, unproductive landed estates that were held by the monastic orders and the church, which they considered national property that had been wrongly appropriated, France reduced its national debt by over 100 million sterling.
100 million?
And on top of that, they lowered annual taxes by several millions. This demonstrated that the revolutionary government was financially solvent and efficient, directly contradicting all of Burke's fear-mongering about national chaos and bankruptcy.
This shift toward solvency and peace then leads directly into Paine's definition of the political alternative, republicanism. Now, we often think of a republic as just, a representative democracy. But Paine's definition is more about its purpose.
It is. For Paine, a republic is any government that is focused on the res publica, the public good.
Mm-hmm.
That is the only valid purpose of governance. It isn't necessarily tied to a single form, but the representative system naturally associates with it.
Why is that?
Because representation is the form that is best calculated to ensure that the government's interest remains aligned with the nation's interest.
And this alignment of interest is why republics are, by their very nature, more peaceful than monarchies.
Exactly. Monarchies are driven by separate proprietary interests.
Mm-hmm.
The king's family dominion, the need for revenue to fund his court, the necessity of finding jobs for the aristocracy's younger sons. War is their trade, as he says.
Whereas a republic
has no interest distinct from the nation's overall prosperity. And war is expensive. It's destructive to commerce. It drains the public good. Therefore, a republic is inherently pacific.
So if monarchy thrives on war, the republic thrives on commerce.
Yes. Paine suggests that commerce is the most effectual means of promoting civilization and peace. Commerce, built on mutual and reciprocal interest between nations, is always cheaper and infinitely more commodious than war. It's a pacific system that operates to cordialize mankind by rendering nations useful to each other.
Making them economically interdependent rather than militarily competitive.
It's an early and incredibly powerful articulation of economic liberalism as a driver for global peace.
Okay, this is the part of the book that I think is just genuinely shocking to most modern readers. This is where Paine stops being a critic or a philosopher and becomes this radical, practical social architect.
He does. He takes the calculated surplus that he gets from abolishing the monarchy and the war establishment, a surplus of several millions of pounds, and he designs a comprehensive program that addresses poverty, education, aging, and economic equality all at the same time.
And what's so revolutionary here is that he's framing these provisions not as discretionary charity, which was the existing poor law framework, but as a non-negotiable right.
Absolutely. That is the key shift. He starts by proposing immediate tax relief. He estimates that a peacetime government should only cost about 1.5 million pounds. The huge resulting surplus is then used to abolish the most oppressive taxes that were felt by the working class.
Which taxes specifically did he want to get rid of?
He targeted the poor rates, which were these locally administered taxes that were incredibly punitive and inefficient. He targeted a tax on houses and windows, which penalized even the smallest dwellings. And he targeted something called the commutation tax.
We probably need to define that one. What was the commutation tax and why was abolishing it such a big deal?
So the commutation tax, which amounted to a massive $771,657 a year, was a tax levied on things like tea and other consumer goods.
Right.
It was intended to commute or replace the loss of revenue from a reduction in the window tax. It sounds obscure, but it was a heavy burden placed almost entirely on the consumption of the poor and the middle classes.
So eliminating those three taxes alone provided immediate relief and also freed up all this funding for his new system.
Exactly.
So let's break down the two cornerstones of that new system. Relief for children, which is tied to universal education, and relief for the aged, his annuity system. How does he propose replacing the poor rates for children?
He would completely abolish the poor rates and instead pay families £4 sterling per year for every child under the age of 14.
£4 per child. That's a significant sum for a working family in the 18th century.
It is, and it was contingent upon one key requirement. The parents had to send the children to school, to learn reading, writing, and common arithmetic.
So this isn't just basic income. This is conditional welfare tied directly to mandatory universal education. That is a truly modern concept.
And he didn't even limit it only to the destitute. He also allocated funds for educating the children of families who were, in his words, not properly of the class of poor, recognizing that a nation simply cannot afford ignorance. For Paine, ignorance is only required for monarchical and aristocratical governments to function. A republic requires an informed citizenry.
And this £4 payment would have supported hundreds of thousands of children.
It would have. Now, the aged annuity is even more sophisticated because he links it directly to the taxes that people have already paid throughout their lifetime.
This is why he can frame it as a right, not as charity.
Yes, he does the math. He calculates that every person, male and female, pays, on average, £2, 8 shillings and 6 pence annually in taxes from the moment they're born through consumption and other indirect duties. By the time you reach age 60, that totals over $154.
So the state isn't giving them money, it's just returning their own contribution, like a public pension system or even a rudimentary version of a tontine.
Precisely. So he institutes an annuity that begins at age 50, which is the point where physical labor starts to decline. That pays £6 per year. Then, at age 60, when direct labor should be over, the annuity increases to £10 per year.
And how many people would that support?
He estimated this really ambitious program would support about 140,000 aged persons, and it would cost over £1 million sterling annually, all paid for by the surplus.
Now, beyond the consistent poor, he also makes provisions for what he claims the casual poor people facing temporary distress.
Yeah, he sets aside smaller grants for this. 20 shillings for every birth, and 20 shillings for every marriage for those who claim it due to necessity.
Yeah.
And £20,000 is allocated specifically for the funeral expenses of traveling workers who might die away from home.
But the most insightful social innovation here is the idea of these public employment structures.
The asylum.
Right. What was their function? Why did he need to establish them separately from the existing workhouses?
These were massive employment buildings he proposed for cities like London, capable of housing at least 6,000 people. And they were designed for the temporarily distressed, not the chronically idle. Anyone could come, find work suited to them based on their trade, get a warm place to sleep, clean clothes, and regular meals.
And a portion of their earnings would be saved for them.
Yes, so upon leaving, they would have some money. The goal was to allow people who had suffered some temporary misfortune, sickness, loss of a job, a bad harvest, to recruit themselves and search for better permanent employment. It was designed to prevent them from falling into that vicious cycle of destitution and petty crime.
He also tackles the military transition. If he's advocating for peace, he can't just throw thousands of soldiers out onto the street.
That would defeat the entire social purpose of the plan. So he accounts for this directly in the budget. He proposes disbanding 15,000 soldiers and providing them with guaranteed life annuities of 3 shillings a week.
And he also increases the pay for the soldiers who remain.
He does. This £500,000 expense is a conscious investment in social stability, recognizing that the cost will eventually vanish as the annuitants pass away, allowing for even further tax reductions down the line.
And finally, we get to his solution to abolish the aristocracy and the law of primogeniture without bloodshed: the steeply progressive estate tax. This is arguably his most radical economic proposal.
This is revolutionary political economy. It's designed to achieve social restructuring purely through taxation. He argued that overgrown estates are a luxury and therefore a proper object of taxation, specifically designed to supersede the unnatural law of primogeniture.
How steep was this progression, and how did it financially force the division of property?
It was punitive. The tax started very lightly, just 3 pence per pound for estates up to £500 of annual income. But the marginal rate accelerated drastically. The tax on income over the £23,000 of income reached a marginal rate of 20 shillings per pound.
Wait, 20 shillings to the pound, that's 100%.
A 100% marginal tax rate on the wealthiest bracket in an 18th century financial document. It's astonishing.
So what was the intention?
The intention was to make it financially irrational to maintain a huge, concentrated estate for one single heir. Based on his tables, the net profit you could make from an estate plateaus very sharply after about £13,000 of annual income.
So if you were a duke with an estate generating, say, £23,000 a year, the government would take over £10,000 of that in tax.
Correct. But if that same duke were to divide that estate among 5 children, giving them about £4,000 each and maybe £3,000, the total tax burden on all those smaller divided estates would plummet to just over £1,100.
The tax system punishes consolidation and rewards division.
It forces family justice by making it financially ruinous to adhere to the ancient custom of primogeniture. It's quiet systemic reform through the tax code.
This massive package, universal education, age security, unemployment relief, military transition, economic leveling, this is Paine's ultimate argument.
It is. He proved that the financial instability and the social misery of England were not due to an inherent lack of resources, but to the expense and corruption inherent in the monarchical structure itself.
And all of this flows toward his final vision: international peace, guaranteed by cooperation.
He concludes by reiterating that call for an alliance between England, France, and America. This powerful liberal alliance, he believed, would establish a national champion for freedom in both the Western world and in Europe. He suggests that the ongoing intrigue of courts, which keeps the system of war alive, will eventually provoke a global, rational confederation of nations whose unified economic interests will abolish the system of war entirely. #outro.
What Thomas Paine achieved in Rights of Man was, well, it was unprecedented. He didn't just write a political pamphlet. He provided a moral, a philosophical, and most importantly, a fully itemized financial framework for building a completely new governmental structure.
He replaced the costly opacity of monarchy with the solvency and transparency of a rationally structured republic. He ensured that the wealth generated by the people was returned to the people as fundamental rights, not as intermittent charity.
And he demonstrated pretty conclusively that the exorbitant expense of government in his era wasn't due to necessity, but due to systemic corruption, the hereditary principle, and the constant perpetuation of war.
And by demonstrating the financial mechanism for freedom, he gave the common person the vocabulary to demand reform based not just on ideals, but on rational self-interest.
And his final message is one of irreversible progress, a progress rooted in the power of knowledge itself. He believed the American and French revolutions had thrown an undeniable beam of light over the world.
Yeah, he saw knowledge as the ultimate defense against tyranny. As he famously wrote, ignorance is of a peculiar nature. Once dispelled, it is impossible to reestablish it.
It has never yet been discovered how to make man unknow his knowledge or unthink his thoughts.
Exactly. Once a nation understands its rights and sees the rational, financial, and moral superiority of a representative system, there is no going back.
That sentiment really reminds us that progress is so often defined by that conflict between precedent and improvement. If governments are content to go on by precedent, by following, as Paine described them, the ghosts of departed wisdom, while the nations they govern continue to go on by improvement, they must at last come to a final separation.
And that leads us to the critical question that Paine's blueprint still poses to us today. When we examine our own institutions, which are still so often based on inherited structures or old precedents, what is the duty of the living generation?
How do we leverage the knowledge we possess today to reform systems that no longer align with reason or the collective good?
And what are the eternal principles of right that we must institutionalize for the benefit of the future?
That's something for you to think about as you navigate the structures of power today. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us.